Hello and welcome. My name is Michael Greco and my colleague is Jocelyn Lockyer. We'll just quickly introduce ourselves. My background is a professor in the area of medical education, and I've been in the space of researching and supporting clinicians with multi-source feedback over the past 15 years. It's something very passionate about. It's something I find that clinicians really value, and we'll be going through some of the tips and Jocelyn she'll tell about herself in a minute, and we'll both be going through some tips about how to support you when you're conducting your debriefing sessions, whether in a formal way as a trained coach or whether in an informal way in terms of peer discussion, what we call a supporting medical colleague. Over to you, Jocelyn. It's lovely to see you. Jocelyn's all the way from Canada, and I think it's evening there. It's morning here in Australia. Welcome, Jocelyn.
Thank you, but it's summer in Calgary still, so that helps. Yes, I'm a Professor Emerita at the University of Calgary, Cumming School of Medicine. I got involved with multi-source feedback in the mid-90s and worked with the Physician Achievement Review Program of the regulatory authority in my province of Alberta, as well as with the Medical Council of Canada and the National Board of Medical Examiners. Subsequently, I did get involved in the development of the R2C2 model, which we will talk about in a bit.
Thanks, Jocelyn. So what is multi-source feedback? Some people refer to it as 360-degree feedback. Others refer to it as MSF. And in Australia, we're now hearing the term multi-source feedback. And I guess generically, it's really about giving clinicians feedback in a structured way that they wouldn't normally get in a sort of structured way. It's around what patients think of your communication skills, and also what clinicians think about you, and even non-clinicians about your professionalism. So it's that sort of holistic view in a structured way of those skills that we don't usually get feedback. We might get feedback on our referral patterns or our, the way we undertake various consultations, our diagnostic skills. But usually our communication skills and our professional skills, the way we work within a team, the way we self-reflect, the way we carry ourselves as doctors is something we don't normally get feedback. So that's what multi-source feedback gives us, structured feedback. And as I mentioned earlier, it comprises of, in terms of the structured feedback, 3 components: patient feedback, and that's conducted by a question. All these are by questionnaires. So what is the patient's experience of my care? How do they see me? It's also colleague feedback. So these are a group of both fellow clinicians, whether they be medical or non-medical, and also administrative and managerial folk as well. Really the whole care team providing feedback on how they see you as a professional doctor. And there is a third component that's very important, and that's the doctor self-assessing themselves. It's important that they have an opportunity to reflect about their performance. So that allows us then to see how is the doctor viewing themselves compared to how others view them. And you might be asking, well, why is all this important? Well, it's very important in the Australian context. The Medical Board of Australia have produced a professional performance framework, and many of you will know as debriefers, whether formal debriefers, trained coaches, or supporting medical colleagues, that we are seeing a change in the structure of CPD, continuous professional development, that each college now is asking their doctors to undertake 50 hours of CPD per year, and that 50 hours is not just attending lectures for 50 hours in the year, but has to be broken down into 3 areas. And what multi-source feedback does is pick up on 2 of those areas, which is reviewing performance and measuring outcomes. So they're 2 of the 3 domains. The other domain is educational activities. So multi-source feedback will pick up on 2 of those domains. Specifically, the patient feedback picks up on measuring outcomes, the patient experience element, and colleague feedback picks up on the reviewing performance component. So the Medical Board of Australia's professional performance framework is asking clinicians to better self-reflect. It's changing the structure of CPD, and multi-source feedback is a key component within the new agenda going forward from January 2023.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about the R2C2, and I know that sounds like a bad movie or an old movie. It's a coaching and facilitated feedback model. Now, we call it a facilitated model, and we also talk about it in stages, but actually it's an iterative model, because sometimes when you coach, you get stuck, or you need to zing back and rebuild the relationship. So there's 4 steps. The first step is really making sure you have a comfortable relationship. Next step is about exploring reactions and reflections, confirming content, and then coaching for change and co-creating an action plan. And I'll talk about each of those in the next few slides. My colleagues in, well, actually more than Canada, US, there were folks from the Netherlands as well, and the United Kingdom did a study around, well, 2010, it was a little bit before that, and said, how do people self-assess anyway? And we did focus groups with medical students, with trainees, and with licensed physicians, trying to understand how people self-assessed. And what we learned was there was buckets of information that came zinging at doctors all of the time, and medical students and trainees as well. Some of it was external, reports that people got, feedback from referral letters. Some of it was just, boy, didn't do well today, I just don't feel very good about it. What we figured out was that the doctors interpreted the information. In some cases, they reflected on it. Other times, they compared it with other data to see if it was valid. Sometimes they calibrated it or filtered it. Sometimes they assimilated. In the end, they made a decision, and sometimes it was to ignore the data. There was stimuli always. Let's just ignore it. Sometimes it was rejected. Sometimes the doctors sought other information to confirm, and sometimes the doctor accepted the data. But what we found out was there's a context to it that also affected responses. The context involved tensions, how I felt about my colleagues, and how I felt working in that environment. But there were also external conditions, including what the climate was, people's emotions, their confidence, and the perceived credibility of the feedback. All of these also affected how people used their feedback. And we did have a component of that study that did involve multi-source feedback. It wasn't only, there were other stimuli as well. So we put our heads together and said, just a second, and this was led by Joan Sargent at Dalhousie University. Goodness, you know, it appears that people don't have a very structured way of helping other doctors, helping trainees or medical students understand and use their data. We began to build a model, and there was a fair amount of research and theory we drew on. One is, of course, the self-assessment work that I described. Other is the person-centered approaches. And for those of you who are in practice and have been doing motivational interviewing, motivational approaches, you understand how important it is to be person-centered. But there also are cognitive domains that influence a behavior change. These are things like physician, their doctor's skill, their behavior, whether they think they can do it. Those types of things also affect the physician. We knew from continuing medical education work that there was that if we could get people to commit to making changes, they were more likely to make the changes. And so that's why the fourth stage is around that coaching to get a commitment to change. There's also an aspect out of implementation science, which tells us just how critically important the facilitator is in helping the doctor make sense of their data. Because, multi-source feedback data is simply data. It has to be interpreted and seems to work best when there is a coach or a supportive person who can help the doctor make sense of it. So the R2C2 model is designed to help the doctor reflect on their performance, assess their work, promote feedback acceptance, facilitate a direction for improvement, and then coach or facilitate to get the change. So lots of research. I think there's half a dozen publications that our research group has done. And then there's other work that's been done elsewhere, including work that Michael was involved in with Michael Pooley in Australia. And we're quite thrilled that others have picked up on the model. What we've found out, though, is that the model works across disciplines, works across different levels of training and different formats. It facilitates feedback, but the facilitator has to be attentive to both the content and the process. By content, I mean your job as a coach will be to go through the physician's data, the doctor's data, help understand the data well enough that you can have a conversation with the doctor, but then be attentive to process things like listening, encouraging, asking open-ended questions. What we've also found is that coaching helps to co-create a plan, and it moves away from assessment and judgment to development and progress. And in fact, we found in a couple of studies that if you can co-facilitate the action plan, you're more likely to have it implemented than if the doctor alone comes up with a plan, or if the coach comes up with a plan, it's not as successful. But we also know that it requires documentation, and that some people will require more direction. And we certainly like to think of this as a very democratic, egalitarian model, but the truth is not all participants will have the same ability to think through their data and come up with an action plan. But with a little help, they can get there. So the 4 stages, and I mentioned them before, but they are build a relationship, explore reaction and reflections, confirm the content, and coach for change and co-create an action plan. So let's look at the first stage, which is about the relationship. Beginning the relationship, it's helpful, important, absolutely critical that the coach talks about themselves. You know, I've been in practice for X years. I've worked in such and such a setting, so that there's a level of trust. Talk about how many sessions you've done or how many doctors you've worked with. And then, even though you may have a bit of data or understanding about that work setting, it's also useful to ask about it, because you may be surprised at the things that the doctor is doing. If it's a resident or a trainee, somebody in training, you might also ask about their program, the current rotations, how well they're doing. And if you're not getting very far, you can also ask them about their experience in preparing for the assessment. But whatever you do, really try to work hard on establishing a relationship at the get-go, but also, if you need to, come back to it. Then the next stage, you're really trying to get the reactions to and reflections on the report. There'll be many doctors who will never have seen a multi-source feedback report in the past, or have had that experience. And so what you want to do is to make sure they feel understood, but also that you're respecting them. So start open-ended. What struck you about the report? What were some of your initial reactions? What were the surprises? Did the data you found out, was it aligned with how you thought about yourself? And sometimes you just have to say, well, you know, sometimes we get feedback that just isn't the same way we see ourselves. In the third stage, really your task is to explore the doctor's understanding of the content. What does it mean? What do they think are the priorities? Were there things that didn't make sense, or they were unclear about it? While I discourage you from going through it section by section, there may be occasions where you have to. But the goal here is to really identify the things that you can work on to co-create the action plan, because in coaching, you're really trying to enhance their learning and development, and you're trying to create it in a supportive and encouraging environment. So here in the coaching stage, you're really getting at the plan. So you want them to identify changes, but you also want them to identify changes that are, we would call SMART goals, specific, measurable, actionable, timely, certainly goals that they can do, that are feasible. And so if somebody says, well, I'm going to implement an electronic medical record system in the next 3 months, that's probably where you draw a deep breath and say, well, let's maybe be a little more specific. Or if you have the trainee, and this is a common one, oh, I get feedback that I don't know enough. I'm going to read every morning about all my cases. Well, maybe that's not what you want. Maybe you want them to cherry pick some of the areas that they don't know very much about, but also to recognize that that might not be as feasible as they think. So it's really identifying the changes they want to work on, starting and doing them sequentially. So what is the first change? How would you go about doing it? What kind of a timeline do you have? And particularly so that you will see results. Get them to talk about the resources they'll need. Resources may be equipment, but it's just as likely to be other physicians, maybe feedback from nurses. Perhaps it's feedback from a more senior trainee, whoever can observe and see how they're doing so that they can get that feedback. And then you really want them to think about barriers, but also enablers, so that they're approaching this in as practical a way, and so that they will see success at the end or in the next stage. So just to reiterate, we are talking about a four-stage model that includes building the relationship, exploring reactions and reflections, confirming content, and then coaching for change and co-creating an action plan. And then there's quite a bit of resources available to you, and they're outlined on this slide and on the website.